Welcome everybody. Nice to see you, and nice to see so many with us today. My name is Jonas Gejl, and I'm an assistant professor at the Royal Danish Defence College, where I work at the Department for Strategy and War Studies. Together with my colleague, Associate Professor Elias Götz, we have written Russia's quest for influence in Africa after the 2022 Ukrainian invasion. We decided that we would like to, in the following order, understand what instruments are Russia actually using to expand and seek influence on the continent. What are the possible causes among a lot of causes, of course, but what are some of the key drivers in Russia's influence-seeking behavior? And then we will also take a look at some of the consequences. We are not doing this on our own. Today we have invited two experts that will help us understand and look at some of the prospect on Russian PMCs and the future of their work in Africa, and also on African states' voting behavior in the United Nations. There are still a lot of printed reports in the back. Feel free to take one. It's completely free of charge, or nothing is free. It's paid for by the Danish taxpayers, I guess. And then, of course, it's also available online. Okay. In the wake of Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, many commentators and also scholars alike expected that Moscow would actually scale down its ambitions in Africa, scale down its presence in Africa, because the war would draw a lot of resources in Europe. So a lot of people thought that Russia would be concentrated in Europe and drawing out resources from its activities in Africa. However, that was not exactly what we saw. Quite the opposite, actually, Elias and I, among others, find in our report. Russia has continued and in some regards also ramped up its activities on the continent and its presence. Russian military contractors arrived recently in Niger, and this is just one of the latest examples of Russia continuing and even ramping up its activities on the continent. Officially, the Russian military contractors are there to help the Niger military junta to fight terrorism, but they also brought with them air defense systems. And then, of course, one can do one's own speculation without being a soldier, that how are you most ideally fighting terrorism with air defense systems? Are they flying around in choppers? Potentially, but maybe there are other causes for why they brought that piece of military equipment with them. Western government officials and analysts are viewing this development in Africa with growing unease and growing concern. And these worries, these concerns, have only been amplified by African states' voting behavior in regards with the 6 UN General Assembly resolutions that targeted Russia's invasion and tried to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For instance, in the emergency session in the General Assembly on March 2nd, 2022, 28 African countries condemned Russia's attack on Ukraine. However, of the countries that decided to abstain, 2/3 of the 35 abstentions in the General Assembly came from African countries. So it is in that regard also worth taking note of that hardly any African states decided to join the economic sanctions of Russia. And this, of course, gave rise to speculation of where Africa as a continent, but also specific African states, are leaning in terms of this growing antagonism between Russia and the West. So Western diplomats and observers, they were quite surprised by these numbers, and it gave rise to some questions. We address 3 questions in our report. First, to what extent can Russia affect the political alignment choices and voting behavior of African states, in the UN more specifically? Second, how and with what instrument is Russia seeking to exert influence vis-à-vis African countries? Finally, what are the underlying sources of Russia's influence-seeking efforts on the continent? This is the program. We are amidst the introduction. I will be presenting some of the main findings of the report Elias and I wrote together. Then Suzanne Graham from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa will be joining us with a talk on African voting behavior in the UN system. After that, DIIS' own Philippa Larsen will share her insights on Russia's use of PMCs in Africa after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And then there will be significant, I would say, time for Q&A from the audience. Today's seminar is part of a larger project framework on the UN peace and security carried out here by DIIS. The UN Peace and Security Framework, it is funded by the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it aims to increase the knowledge base and overall level of information on topics and themes that are central for the UN, and Denmark's launch for its bid of becoming a non-permanent, having a non-permanent seat at the UN National Security Council in 2025-2026. We would also like to extend a warm thank you to our invited scholars, Suzanne Graham and soon to be Dr. Karen Philippa Larsen. Also the audience, both here present and also online. And we will really genuinely be looking forward to your questions when we have the Q&A. Also thank you to DIIS for once again organizing a very, very professional event here. The event coordination is doing a great job of even having these 2 platforms with physical and the online meet, and for now it seems to be working. So this is perfect. And then also a warm thank you to senior researcher here at DIIS, Marie-Louise Clausen, who originally invited me and Elias on board on this project and also other projects we have written here at DIIS on Russia and Africa. I will return with a more detailed introductions to Suzanne and Karen as we proceed. All right. To the report. This is a picture of Elias, since he couldn't be here today, unfortunately because of illness. I brought him with me here in good spirits with a really scholarly-like picture of him, I would say. And then a picture of the beautiful report. Okay, so what are some of the main conclusions that we derive from our research? Well, first of all, Russia has at least maintained and also, as I said, in some cases ramped up its quest for influence in Africa after the invasion of Ukraine. I think this is the most important finding. Russia is to stay in Africa, but we could also expect that Russia will be expanding its power base and influence base in Africa. Its influence-seeking behavior is fueled by a mix of status aspirations. It wants to be a great power and it wants to be recognized as a great power, and great powers, they have a global reach. So Africa is also about fueling Russian self-understanding as a great power with global reach, not simply a regional power that is operating primarily in the post-Soviet space. It also has some of the causes also are in the family resemblance of these geopolitical impulses. That's about political and military reach. Africa in that regard is quite important for various reasons I will attend to in some minutes. And then of course there are also commercial interests with vast natural resources that you can acquire, but also you can deny others access to. I think that is as importantly that of course there are things to be gained for Russia and Africa, but a lot of the reason for why Russia is in Africa is also to deny others access, for instance, to strategically important ports, military bases, or natural resources. It employs a mix of various instruments we will be looking closer at in a minute. Security, offering security assistance to the African regimes that is in dire need of assistance. Arms, that is containers of weapons being shipped to African states in need. Diplomacy, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has been traveling extensively around the African continent after the war in Ukraine began. And then also within the realm of information operations. And it is, of course, employing these instruments to enhance its influence in Africa. To a certain extent, we also find that Russia has actually been able to successfully capitalize or instrumentalize this influence it has gained in Africa in order to sway, for instance, African states in the UN to vote in ways that are more pro or leaning towards Russia's interests in the UN than the Western states' interest. And of course, African states, this should not be mistaken for Russia is deciding everything African states do. That would be a mistake. But it is about that, of course, are various reasons for why states do as they do, and international influence is, of course, among one of the factors that are deciding why and how states are acting the way they're doing. Finally, in terms of implications, I think the most important implication from what we find of Russia's behavior in Africa, that is, it is important that the way we tailor our own strategies in Denmark and beyond should be about more than simply containing Russia. I think that would be a very cynical way of seeing Africa as a grand chessboard where it's about a zero-sum game about what is gained by Russia is lost by the West. I think that would be highly counterproductive. And it will also, I think, misalign with current African strategies also propelled by Denmark. It is important that any strategy, any engagement with African states should be context-based. That means that we should do, and probably also do more to understand that we are not dealing with a continent here. We are dealing with various countries, with various interests at stake, and various visions and problems and challenges, as we would see in Europe. Europe is also not a continent, right? With completely uniform interests. So is Africa, of course, not. So we should really enhance our knowledge base about what is going on. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs should maybe bring in more subject matter experts that understands the regional but also local dynamics various places in Africa. And then, of course, do an honest job of understanding what are the aspirations, what is to be achieved and want to be achieved by African leaders. All right. And then also a cautious note. Yes, Russia is seeking to expand its influence in Africa. Yes, it has also, I think, to a certain degree, succeeded in doing so, but Russia is also still a fairly small player, at least if we look in terms of economics in Africa. These are the exports to Africa from 2019 to 2022. Exports to Africa from the Russian Federations account to 4%. The same goes with imports from Africa. Russia is importing about 1% of the produced goods and services in this duration of time. And if one is adhering to the the dictum of it's the economy stupid. Russia is not, in that sense, a great player in Africa. However, and this is a very important, however, Russia has a lot of other things on its shelf to offer African regimes that is not necessarily about economics. And I think this is also why we should be addressing security assistance first. Russia has been very, very active in promoting and offering various forms of formal and informal security assistance to African regimes. We see that in Libya, we see that in the Central African Republic, we see that in Mali, we see that also now in Niger, and we could mention a lot of other African states. Within the last 5 years, Russia has signed more than 20 military cooperation agreements with African states. As often substantial part of these security assistance packages that Russia is offering is providing Russian PMCs, that's private military contractors, guns for hire, you could also say. It could be PMCs like Redut, Patriot, the Wagner group, now known as the Africa Corps in Africa. One could say a rather weird core one would like to be compared to in Africa for various historical reasons. And then, of course, these PMCs are key to the instrumentalization of these security assistance agreements. And what it essentially is, this is a very, very fortunate piece of assistance if you are an African regime that face dire security needs, that Russia can quite swiftly, quite significantly offer you the security you need in order to have your regime survive. So if survival or an immediate need for political stability is what you would like to achieve as an African leader, security assistance offered by Russia is no unattractive way to proceed. So this is a very prominent piece of instrument in the Russian toolbox. We also have arms transfers. So unlike the wider economic export and import, Russia is figuring quite prominently in terms of arms exports to Africa. So in the period from 2019 to 2022, Russia has provided 51% of all arms to Africa, at least in the numbers that are available. Then comes in France and the United States, and to a lesser degree China. This is quite significantly. And it also tells something about, again, that security, arms, weapons, that's really some of Russia's favorite, but also most potential tools. And then again, how can you enhance your influence in Africa by offering arms? Well, you can do so because arms provide path dependencies. A lot of African states use, as a lot of other states, older Soviet equipment. And who is one of the prominent providers of replacement parts, ammunition, and so forth for these weapons? That's the Russian Federation, right? Because they produce the same damn things in the Soviet Union era. And so today, if you can export your weaponry, well, then you can be pretty sure that you will have to talk again sometime in the future when replacement parts and new munitions are needed. Diplomatic instruments, as I mentioned before, Lavrov has been very eager and very keen to visit an unprecedented number of African leaders since the start of the invasion. So this tells us that it has attracted and gained enhanced prominence by Russia, at least to establishing ties that could later, of course, be used, sometimes to the benefit, of course. It's not illegal to establish diplomatic ties, but it can also be a way to align interests or persuade persuade states, of course, to lean more towards a pro-Russian stance. And I think quite substantially here, the whole grain agreement involving Ukraine. And of course, some of you might know that the export of grain to the African continent and other places on Earth has been quite significantly affected by the war in Ukraine. It dropped because Ukraine could not ship its grain without significant risk of harm. So you needed to make an agreement involving Russia to let these ships proceed to their destinations and offer grain. And this has been one of these main discussion points in the world opinion also. Who is to blame for the lack and shortages of grain in Africa? Is it Russia? Is it Ukraine? And Russia has quite extensively used the grain as a way to show that Ukraine is definitely to blame for the shortages of grain, with disastrous effects in Africa, disregarding that this is not necessarily reflecting what the real causes for this shortage is. And then finally, information operations. We have a illustration here provided by the think tank Africa Center that has showing various states in Africa being targeted by 1, that is blue, 2, that is yellow, or 3, that is red, Russian information campaigns. And of course, the ones with flags of the Russian Federation is those that you can ascribe to Russian influence. Of course, there's a lot of information operations going on in Africa as in Europe that has nothing to do with Russia. I mean, this should not be seen in vacuum. It's not all Russia. But here are some of the countries where at least the Africa Center can show that that Russia had a role in these campaigns. And then, of course, vast propaganda, where we have seen the Wagner Group by local newspapers, radio stations, media outlets, even produce their own movies targeting African African audiences in order to enhance and make a more positive image of Russia. Okay, so what are some of the causes? As I mentioned before, great power status. One should not underestimate how important it is at an immaterial level to be recognized and also understand yourself as a great power, in particularly if taking into account that in 1991, the Soviet Union, that is an empire, collapsed. The center of gravity in the Soviet Empire, and before that, the Tsarist Empire, that was Russia. And of course, when that collapsed, it was the first time in Russian history where it would have to deal with, we are no longer an empire, then what are we? How should we understand what it means to be Russian and what it should mean in the future? And in that context, politically, if we look into Russian domestic politics, the self-understanding of being a great power has been important. And what defines great powers? Well, of course, it helps if you have a seat with a veto in the UN Security Council. Russia, without a fight, took over the Soviet Union's seat. That is, of course, a good thing. But also global reach, that you can be present various places in the world. And also that other states, preferably, would have to ask you what you think about this and that. That defines a great power. And therefore, Africa, for that reason, but also other reasons, are important because it stresses that Russia is a global great power. And that is particularly important in a context after the Ukrainian war, where the West, I think quite explicitly, has been trying to isolate Russia, right? Isolate Russia, showing it's a regional power that is not behaving appropriately, right? So Russia has really, for this reason, been eager to show we are not isolated at all, and there are a lot of other non-Western countries in the world that is not sharing this understanding of Russia not being a great power. Then, of course, geopolitics. Africa is for various reasons important in terms of access to military bases and ports, but it's also important in the wider understanding of you want to be places of strategic importance in order to engage in this growing antagonism between Russia and the West. Africa provides you with political and military reach. For instance, it's really nice to be situated on the African continent and be able to exercise influence there when you are situated northern Africa on what we could and what is often referred to as the EU's southern flank, right? You can steer up, you can influence, for instance, migration patterns. So if you want to pressure in this zero-sum understanding of geopolitics, if you want to pressure the EU, you can do what you do best to steer up political instability so people will begin to migrate towards Europe, right? Because what is one thing that can get almost any European politician up from the chair, that is migration, right? That is migration pressing Europe, because that will initiate a political discussion on how, for instance, should we distribute refugees and so forth, which is going on at the moment. But of course, you're also situated close to global, primarily maritime trading routes, and are able to influence the stability of these routes. And then, of course, there's also commerce, that it's about gaining control, as I said earlier, with natural resources. That can be for private interest. Russian PMCs are often also helping out by establishing control, for instance, with local gold mines, or it could be places of oil and gas extraction and taking parts of this profit themselves. For being there, but also for more national interest. For instance, it's very nice for Russia to be able to trade with other states outside of Europe after the targeting of international sanctions. That you have access to other markets is, of course, important, and that you can gain, but also deny others access to strategically important resources, but also deny them the opportunity to gain future trading partners and so forth. Okay, well, to derive at the consequences, where we have been taking a closer look at the voting in the United Nations, more specifically the six resolutions in the General Assembly of the UN, we could see that Africa is showing a peculiar and puzzling degree of abstentions. That is, that they decide to not vote either yes or no, they simply abstain from voting. And of course, one should be very careful of not confusing correlation, that is A influences B. Correlation, that is with the BC, A and B, they are in flux in same direction, with causation, that is A is causing B. We cannot be completely sure that this puzzling degree of abstention is solely caused by Russian growing influence on the African continent. However, we can see a degree of correlation in terms of African states that are typically relying on Russian security assistance, that have developed closer ties with Russia diplomatically, and so forth, and we also see a higher frequency of Russian information operations. They would also be more prone to vote in the UN in a way that would be beneficial of Russia. Whether this is caused by Russia alone, well, that's for the intelligence services to get a better grasp at, right? That is where me and Elias's research stops, and others will have to carry on. But we can at least see there are correlation between these two things. And I guess that stresses that some African states, of course, have more leverage than others. Eritrea is one of the states that is relying on Russia and is also not even abstaining from voting. Often it also vote blank no to these resolutions. That is understandable if you rely very much on a partner and they would really like you to see you vote in a specific way. And then, of course, Egypt. Egypt, quite a significant player in the African continent, and also one with a lot of different and varied diplomatic contacts. Well, they can more decide on their own right. It will also be a loss for Russia in that case if diplomatic relation is worsened too much between Egypt and Russia because of a fallout in the UN. But we can maybe go more into this later on. So now I will lend the word to Dr. Suzanne Graham. She's an associate professor of international relations at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. In her doctoral research, she has been focusing on South Africa's voting behavior in the United Nations between 1994 and 2008. And since then, her research and teaching has been focusing on foreign policy, the United Nations, other international organizations, and also international conflict. So welcome, Suzanne, and looking forward for your presentation.
Thank you so much to Jonas and Elias and DIIS for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to be here. I hope that everybody can hear me in the room. We did test beforehand, but I just want to make sure that people can hear me in the room and that you're able to see my slides. They should be, shared on the screen right now. So I just want to initially begin by saying thank you so much to Jonas and Elias for actually creating this document and doing the research. I'm privileged to have access to the document, and I find it actually a very, very meaningful, very valuable piece of work, and I loved reading it. And so what I'm going to be focusing on a little bit more in relation to the discussion today is the African perspective. So this is an area that I'm more interested in. I'm most specifically interested in South Africa's voting behavior, but also the A3 and the UN Security Council and other African states' voting behavior. And so what I'm going to quickly start off with is in relation to why I think it is important to actually reflect on UN votes. And the reason why I've dedicated an entire slide to this, and I'll go through it very quickly, is that there are so many people in today's world that tend to suggest that the United Nations has no real relevance or significance, has no real role to play. And I'm a staunch advocate of the United Nations and believe it does have a role to play. And I think the most important thing for me to really press home is that the whole point of the United Nations environment is really so that all states have a role to play in international affairs. And really, participation at the UN in whichever platform, the UN Security Council, if you're lucky enough as an African state to be voted onto that for your 2 years, or whether you're in the UN General Assembly or any of the other platforms, it's essentially your state's foreign policy in action, and that's why it's so important. It's maybe seen as a relatively minor action. Whether or not you abstain yet or vote yes or vote no surely is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't mean anything, does it? But in actual fact, it does mean quite a lot. Some people suggest that the UN General Assembly, for example, is simply a passive arena and that voting is wholly symbolic. But I think for me, it's very important for understanding any state's foreign policy position in the world to look at the UN General Assembly or Security Council voting records, because they are the historical record of how a state presents itself internationally. It is an indicator of a state's foreign policy behavior. And it is important for us as analysts of international state behavior to try and draw trends and themes from these records. It's an excellent resource for us at hand. And most importantly, and especially in South Africa's case, in the run-up to our elections, which are happening on the 29th of May. So the last year and a half has really been around how consistent our governing party has been in terms of how it represents itself internationally. And this has been part of some debate for some years now, actually, an extended debate. And that is because we all know in this room that in politics, perception is reality. And so how a state acts, its reputation, is dependent on how it's perceived and how it perceives itself. And that goes a long way in terms of how it votes in the United Nations. So if we have a quick look at this cartoon here, you'll see this happened very, very, very early on, the 1st of March, 2022. And it says, there is our President Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, and saying South Africa's position is very clear. So we're not necessarily sitting on the fence, but we're caught in the fence, it seems, over the Russian-Ukraine incident. And for those of you who are following international affairs would know that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the very first response by the Minister of our Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Naledi Pandor, was one of recrimination against Russia. It was immediate, it was public, it was vocal, and essentially called on Russia to immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine in line with the United Nations Charter. And to many, this would be a consistent move on the part of South Africa as a leader in Africa, and it's still considered to be quite a serious power and leader in Africa, economically, politically, in terms of soft power as well. That it was a very consistent move on the part of South Africa to do so, and because after all, we are one of the staunch advocates of political integrity and sovereignty of states, and always have been, at least since 1994, when we became a democratic country. And immediately that statement had to be withdrawn because it was not in line with what the president actually wanted South Africa to say publicly in relation to this. And the Minister Pandor actually had to apologize as a result of that for being out of step with towing the line in this case. And so what we saw was South Africa becoming one of 35 countries, as you see in Jonas and Elias's report, that often abstained on the 6 resolutions related to the Ukraine. But I just want to quickly remind everybody that this is not the first time South Africa, as a country in Africa, has abstained on an issue related to Ukraine. Back in 2014, with the invasion of Crimea, or annexation of Crimea by Russia, there were resolutions put forward in the United Nations at that time as well. South Africa was not a member of the Security Council at the time. It had come off its second term, 2011-2012, 2 years before. But South Africa also chose to abstain at that time. And I think that for those of us, it's very easy to understand the reasoning behind it, or at least understand the logic behind it, because South Africa was a fairly new member to the BRICS consortium at the time, since 2010, and really wanting to invest in that, what it sees and continues to see as a quite important strategic relationship, politically and economically, for the South African, for South Africa. And so I'm just repeating there very quickly what Jonas and Elias's report reflects on, the exact dates and what they were referring to in terms of those resolutions, the fact that South Africa abstained on each one, and that the very same minister who indicated initially that Russia should basically get out of Ukraine then had to backtrack and say instead that South Africa, along with other non-aligned countries, and it's very interesting here to bring in the terminology used during the Cold War. It's almost bringing back the same type of feelings that African countries may have felt during the Cold War, that post-Cold War, non-aligned countries have sought to assert our independence from the power games of the wealthy nations. And when Naledi Pandor says this, she's not referring obviously to Russia or China necessarily, but more specifically to the US and to the UK and to France as a P3 in the UN Security Council, seeking not to become embroiled in the politics of confrontation, name-calling and aggression, but rather to promote a peaceful resolution to the conflict through dialogue and negotiation. So many other African countries would normally look to South Africa in a General Assembly space. South Africa would normally be one of those that, if it had the chance to be a pen holder on a resolution, they would look to South Africa as the one to lead the way in terms of how something should be voted on. So it could very well be the case that if South Africa abstains on something, other African countries will also abstain on something if they feel strongly enough, but it's not always the case. As Jonas very correctly stated in his initial introduction, we really cannot look at Africa as a single mind. It really is made up of independent states with different thinking about international relations, especially in relation to their diplomatic ties with Russia and how that fits into their own plans for survival in a realist world. So this is just quickly showing you from Jonas and Elias's report, the votes, how African states voted on those 6 resolutions. You saw already on some of the graphs he just showed when he was looking at correlation, perhaps not causation, but definitely some correlation, that for the most part, there were a lot of African states that voted in favor and therefore against Russian action. There were states that actually in a very obvious way voted no. And some of those would be, some of you would expect, for example, Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe has historical ties with Russia and very Marxist leanings, as we all know. And so that's not surprising. But it was really quite surprising how many African states chose to abstain in relation to this issue. If you look at, and then of course you have those states that may have been non-voting for whatever reason, and there are some African states that simply don't have the necessary resources to vote in the General Assembly space. They may not have been present for a specific vote. Senegal, for example, I think wasn't present for one vote. But that in fact, African states have taken a very measured approach to this. And if you think about it, those who have access to the report and can flip through it now quickly and look at the back, which shows the appendix of all the African states' voting records on these 6 resolutions, you'll see that another area of study I'm interested in is African small island states. And if you look at all 6 of African small island states, Mauritius, Seychelles, Cabo Verde, Comores, Sao Tome and Principe, etc., they all voted either in favor of the resolutions or very rarely abstained, perhaps abstained on one resolution, but otherwise all voted in favor. And I think it's fairly obvious to understand why they may do so, relying still on their colonial powers, the UK and France for the most part, to assist them on their in their daily survival efforts as small island states. And yet, even though every state in the General Assembly technically and principally has an equal right to a vote and therefore an independent thought on something, these states are still influenced by their ties. So it may very well be the case that some of these African states have been influenced by Russia, just as the small African states, island states, may have been influenced by their colonial ties to the UK and France. So if we go ahead, another point before I bring in this slide here on the cartoon is just to basically suggest to the audience that, in effect, the abstention is the only tool that states without any real or significant power on the global stage can actually use in the UN space to actually make some kind of point, statement, or emphasis without wholly breaking diplomatic relations, whether they voted yes or no, or really burning bridges to such a large extent that it would have an impact on their trading relations or something like that. So abstentions are actually a measured and useful tool by states that they purposefully select, especially in the African space, in order to have some kind of voice in world affairs. And the African bloc, as we all know, is the largest bloc in the General Assembly with 54 votes potentially. But even then, there's not whole consensus, as we've seen in relation to the issue with Russia. And it is most often the case, unless it's related to UN reform, that African states are not always in consensus about issues that are brought to the General Assembly or even to the Security Council if the states are on the Security Council serving a term. So if we have a look at this cartoon here, you'll see that for the most part, international media, especially condemnation of Africa's abstentions, was really this idea that African states should understand, having come from a colonial heritage, what it means to have political integrity and sovereign territory, and sovereign integrity, and that this should be something that African states should therefore fight for and be wholly in favor of. And therefore, it causes great confusion and misunderstanding when different positions, when the African states that we've seen in Jonas and Elias's report have positions on abstentions, which to many people looks like just a state not having a real opinion about something. So you're sitting on the fence about something. But actually, as I said before, it's a measured, purposed choice to make an abstention, in my opinion. But what it does bring up is ambiguity surrounding the positions of African countries, because it brings up this idea of inconsistency. We've also heard at the time when this first happened, these words of hypocrisy, double standards being bandied about by all those states vocal enough in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but used on all sides. South Africa looking at the West as being hypocritical for its invasion of Iraq, for example, or its invasion or interference in the Middle East. They look to France's interference in Western Africa. They look to the UK's interference in terms of some territory still linked to small states, and that these Western powers are wholly basically hypocritical in suggesting that African states should immediately vote against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But South Africa can equally be called hypocritical in the fact that we advocate for political integrity, territorial integrity, and sovereignty, and yet we don't outrightly condemn Russia in the UN space. We just sit on the fence through an abstention. And so there are so many different things we can say about this, but I don't have time. I see I'm running out. So let me quickly talk about this cartoon. So the idea here is that there's a lot of aggravation in the African space that arose immediately after the invasion of Ukraine that suggested that the African country's stance towards this crisis was influenced by Russia, and that it's because of expanding influence and economic footprints, maybe like Jonas was saying in relation to military agreements, etc., that this media unfairly perhaps argued that Africa's refusal to criticize Russia was because of Russia's colonization of Africa. And so this cartoon is essentially saying, well, Russia has never colonized Africa. So it's the use of words there. But this is my last slide, if I'm just allowed this quickly for 1 more minute. Some points that I think are very important to recognize, and that is that in terms of South Africa's approach is very important because it has to be understood in the context of a desire for South Africa to see a balance of forces change to reflect the rise of emerging powers. That's why South Africa is so invested in BRICS. That from a real politic perspective, South Africa accords its alliance with BRICS quite highly, and that its commitment to a constitutional democracy and the fact that it's supposedly a rainbow nation, that it has a democratic worldview, etc., should mean that we have an immediate anti-Russian stance in relation to this invasion of Ukraine, which technically we did have with Naledi Pandor's initial statements. But I think it's very, very important that we note that South Africa, which is actually a reflection of some other African states on the continent, that it is about trying to establish an independent identity in the world of politics. And that when I spoke to a minister in Durko, in our Ministry of International Relations, he was saying that it was about South Africa trying to establish independence, not being a puppet to either side, either Russia, for example, in the Security Council and China, or the US and the UK and France, for example, on the other side. And for South Africa to actually have a mind of its own and to try and establish an identity that is one that is following rules-based multilateral system, promoting dialogue. South Africa has consistently said, for example, that it doesn't believe what Russia did was right, but it doesn't believe that Russia should, that the way America's gone about trying to persecute Russia is the correct thing either. So they're trying to play the game from their perspective. And I think many of the African countries are also trying to play the game from their own perspective. They have to try and balance and walk on a tricky tightrope in international politics. And I think in many respects, this is actually a nuanced way of doing it. And trying to have some kind of measured independence is the only way for them at this stage. So I think I'm going to end there and wait for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susie. Yes, our next speaker is soon to be Dr. Karen Philippa Larsen, PhD candidate here at the Danish Institute for International Studies. Her work, which some of you probably know, is on Russian hybrid warfare. More specifically, you have been dealing with the discourses as well as the uses of private military companies in Russia, and your work has been already published in international journals such as Post-Soviet Affair and International Affairs. So thank you so much, Karen. Looking forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you also from my side for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. I will talk a little bit about Russia's use of PMCs, so that's private military companies in Africa, after the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine. And I disappeared now. Yes, okay, I will start. So I will start by talking a little bit about when we have seen changes, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the PMCs were used before we saw changes, and what parts of that are sort of continued now. Then I'll build on 3 scenarios that you, Jonas and Elias, you line up in this report about future engagements in African states for Russian private military companies, or sort of a semi-state engagement. And then in the very end, I'll just talk a little bit about what does that actually mean. But just to be clear on a timeline here, so Russia, of course, as we know, invaded Ukraine in this full-scale invasion in February 2022. But it wasn't sort of until a year some later when we saw the Wagner Group's leader Prigozhin with his forces turn his forces towards Moscow in what they called a march for justice. So some of you will clearly remember last year when the Wagner Group suddenly marched towards Moscow to have a talk, as they said, with the military top in Russia. Then a few months later, as a consequence of this, dare I say, Prigozhin dies in a plane crash together with the parts of the top of the Wagner Group. They all die in a plane crash in August 2023, and that's actually when we start to see changes begin in the Africa missions of the private military companies. So the Wagner Group is the primary here, and not until we see sort of Prigozhin and the military leadership of the Wagner Group disappear do we see any changes. So that's just sort of to support what you said in the beginning, Jonas, that we actually don't see a change right after the invasion of Ukraine in the engagement in Africa using private military companies. So just to talk a little bit about how and why are they used, these private military companies, and this is also to illustrate the picture behind, this is actually how did the Wagner Group operate in the very in just before these changes. What do we see in Africa? How do they operate? And it goes very well. It plays very well into what you've also said in the report and what you also introduced in the beginning here. So they have developed sort of a modus operandi, you might call it, where they deploy with a military, a political, economic, and also an informational presence. And the military component of their deployment is what we see. So that's the military instructors that we see, but also the boots on the ground soldiers who are actually side by side with the local armed forces fighting in the very front of the fight. We also see a political component often deployed with the Wagner Group, and a political component that's sort of political advisors who can advise heads of state on how sort of they can use their political system in order to stay longer if that's what they want, and how they can also sort of maneuver the space they have politically to gain influence or to keep influence. We see a disinformation component, and within this component we definitely see an attempt to create enforce or use narratives, as you also mentioned in the beginning. We've seen them buy and run a local radio station, newspaper media, billboard advertisements, of course a lot of social media presence, but we've also seen them use exit polls actively that sort of screws results towards very positive opinions of Russia and very negative opinions about France and European states. And all of this is often deployed together with an economic presence, and that's often extraction of resources, and that has sort of been what has paid for this whole thing. So they gain the right to extract mineral or resources. They extract diamond and gold, timber, but they also, in the Central African Republic, for example, they are a large part of an economic structure now. They have a beer brewery, a vodka brewery, and other things that's sort of part of this country's economy. And very importantly, so the Wagner Group, at least, their presence in Africa, from if we go back to sort of the very beginning, why go through this and use a private military company or a semi-state military company? So it's of course, they of course have very close ties with the political elite in Russia, but that's for reasons of plausible deniability that we have heard a lot about when we talk about the Wagner Group, to keep sort of an arm's length principle towards, or an arm's length perspective towards these groups, and in order to be able to say, as has been said, this has nothing to do with us, the Russian state. This is just a normal private company, and they act as they do and as they are allowed to do. Okay, so moving on to sort of the three scenarios taken from the report. The three scenarios in the report is that the GRU takes over the missions in Africa, other PMCs takes over for the Wagner Group, or the Wagner Group continues with a new leader. So this is the change that we can expect to see after the military Prigozhin and the military top of the Wagner Group came down in a plane crash. So just to start with the middle, there are other PMCs who can be and will probably be taking over the Wagner Group's affairs. PMC Redoute is one of them. We've also heard about PMC Convoy. So what's sort of the common denominator of all the PMCs that's popping up in Russia at the moment is that their financiers, they have very close relationships with the Russian political elite and with Putin himself. So they are all connected to this political sphere already, and then sort of starting or beginning to run private military companies. I think so. PMC Redoute, we see them very active in Ukraine. They are used for recruiting. They're used particularly for recruitment in Ukraine and for the Ukraine missions. PMC Convoy is sort of rumored to want to take over the Wagner Group's missions in Central African Republic, and that is perhaps linked to the fact that the military leader Masai, Konstantin Pikalov, has a background in the Wagner Group, and he also deployed with the Wagner Group to the Central African Republic. However, actually, I will not talk so much more about this because I haven't really seen, I haven't seen them take over anything in Africa at the moment. I haven't seen them being active on the African continent, and I haven't seen them sort of take over any Wagner Group's missions there. I will talk a little bit more about the two other scenarios. And the first scenarios is that the GRU, so that's of course the Russian military intelligence service, takes over the Wagner Group's missions. And what we have seen is that they have created this Africa Corps that you also mentioned, or the Expeditionary Corps, which again is a really interesting name, but that's sort of how they have been rebranding the Africa missions, some of the Wagner Group's Africa missions. They're headed by Andrei Avaryanov, who's a GRU Major General. He's the commander of the GRU unit that's been linked to the Skripal poisonings and other sort of similar undercover subversive missions in Europe. Deputy Minister of Defense Yevkurov, he led Russian delegations to several countries, and this happened sort of right after. Oops, sorry. I'll see that. Yeah, and this happened sort of right after the Wagner Group's attempted mutiny or their march for justice. Russia really started being very vocal about the fact that their Africa presence would continue and that we would see business as usual. And we also started seeing these delegations appear with, among others, Yevkurov and Avaryanov, and they visited, for example, Libya, Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, and Mali, which are all sort of countries where the Wagner Group has had a presence, except perhaps for Burkina Faso, but we'll talk about that. We are seeing that they are taken over, or that they are being substituted instead of the Wagner Group some places, but we also see most notably that they are actually opening new missions that the Wagner Group didn't in new countries where the Wagner Group didn't deploy before. So we see them, for example, in Burkina Faso. This picture is from when they arrive in Burkina Faso, and we see them in Niger just recently. They show up there. What they offer, the GRU through the Africa Corps, is sort of allegedly internally described as the regime survival package. And that provides elites in target countries with military support, economic and political protection, and also protection via the UN, which is quite interesting in terms of what we just heard. And then support of political analysts, what I also mentioned before. And to me, that sounds a lot like a continuation of what the Wagner Group created. And sort of as the same kind of elite capture that we see, that and as we see maybe most notably in the Central African Republic, where the Wagner Group is present. So just moving on to the third scenario of the report, and that's the scenario that the Wagner Group continues under a new leadership. And I'm taking this in because that's actually also still occurring. We haven't actually seen a complete removal of the Wagner Group, and that could be because it's still ongoing. This is all happening at the moment. But we do see actually that the Wagner Group is recruiting again. Just recently they started recruiting for their Africa missions. And I think as soon as last week there was a call to join the Wagner Group on their social media sites. We also see their social media sort of propaganda channels. They are still alive with fresh cartoons about how the Wagner Group is saving the day. They are uploading videos from the Wagner Group in the Central African Republic. And the recruitment videos, they show a new commander called signed Lotus. His real name is Anton Elisarov. He also appeared in a video in February from a tent camp in Russia where apparently Wagner Group soldiers were supposed to train as part of the National Guard in Russia for their missions in Ukraine. So he's sort of the new, at least military head of the Wagner Group, and also the one in front in their recruitment videos. And importantly, I want to note that we see them very active in the Central African Republic, and this is also where they have historically the closest ties and where their presence has been so most expanded. But I just want to state that I would still say that they operate on the mercy of the Russian state, in the sense that they have always depended and do still depend on Russian infrastructure and sort of material to move around. Often when they deploy, we see them deploy and return from operations in Russian official military planes, for example. Okay, so sort of just to sum up, we have seen that the Wagner Group is still present and they're recruiting again. We see the Africa Corps engaging in new missions, and we see that they have really a similar modus operandi. They sort of this modus operandi described internally as regime survival package is very similar to what I described to you in the beginning that the Wagner Group also created. So for me, it almost looks like a little bit a way for the Russian state to try to nationalize the presence that the Wagner Group created, to sort of take it back into state control. But I think there are reasons why, so looking a little bit into the future, it's of course always a little bit dangerous, but the Wagner Group may of course be leaving, it may be over, but we also might see them stay for 3 reasons. There are probably more, but I've listed 3. It could be still that some tasks are better left with them. Russia still could sort of try to keep a little bit of an arm's length. The operation in Ukraine definitely made this arm's length a lot shorter, but they might try to sort of still keep it in at least discursively. And then the Wagner Group is a brand. There's no doubt about it. If you look at the pictures here, they are from the Central African Republic. All of it's a bit difficult to see, but they're all wearing T-shirts with the Wagner Group logo on it. The Wagner Group is a brand, and also at least some among, like in some sort of small subcultures, a brand that's viewed upon positively. And then a third could be for this diversification of actors. I think the Russian sort of political elite is perhaps very interested in not creating the same situation as it was previously with Prigozhin and the Wagner Group having quite a large influence on Russian foreign politics and foreign policy in Africa. So a diversification of actors in their Africa presence, I would expect to see that, more of that. That's it. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you so much, Karen, and please stay with me here on the stage, because now we're moving into the Q&A. And Susie, I hope you are with us and can hear us, so people can ask you questions.
I'm here.
Excellent. So, do we have some questions? Yeah, in the back. And I think we should have a mic, right?
Thank you very much. My question is to Karen. I've also done research on US military operations in Africa, and I would like to hear, have you looked into the comparison between Russian PMCs and US, UK-based PMCs, because they are probably still, well, they are by far still the largest military operators in Africa. It's Niels Hahn.
Do I answer now, or do we take a few questions?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. I haven't done sort of direct comparisons, and I'm also quite interested to know, like, what comparison in what regard, like size or number or ways of operating. Just can you follow up?
Well, it could be in all aspects. For example, it could be Academy or Dyncorp. The transition from Sandline and executive outcomes based in South Africa. I think Margaret Thatcher's son was caught at one point and arrested when they tried to make a coup in West Africa years ago.
Yeah.
So also it's in terms of security services they provide, in terms of numbers, in terms of countries where they are present. Because I would still consider that the Russian presence is very small compared to British and American presence.
I haven't looked into sort of numbers comparing, but I can say that there's no doubt about that the Wagner Group is created also with inspiration in other earlier PMCs, private military companies, and especially also in both American and South African PMCs, and we can see some of the ways of operating that is inspired. So, for example, this way of getting minerals, or sort of getting rights to minerals as an exchange for security services. I think we've also seen other PMCs do that. But I don't have any comparison to offer, you know.
Okay, we have another question, and please state your name and also your affiliation.
I have a very long Indian name, but I'll stick to the second name, Mishra. I write for an Indian newspaper. My question also is like, how good is this new role of being independent, etc., among others in South Africa? But I guess India is stating the same things, having the same position, that we want to be neutral, and that way Russia in its diplomatic effort is trying to state that it wants to create a new multipolar world where it's not just the Western hegemony that has to dominate. But how far are the African countries buying this argument, and maybe are convinced about this, that this is also a new diplomatic or political agenda? Thank you.
I think this one goes out to you, Susie.
Is that for me? Thank you so much, Mishra. I appreciate the question. And I think it's a very good question, actually, because I don't think that African countries are very convinced about Russia's actual objectives and goals. I think that African countries are taking a very sober view of things as they happen in a very measured way, as I said in my presentation, because they don't know how things are going to unfold, and they are dependent on the global system in many respects for survival on a daily basis compared to some other states. And so I think it's not that they're utterly convinced, like I said, by Russia's goals, or that Russia has this idea of a multipolar world, because as we all know, Russia essentially is a superpower status, at least in relation to the US. And it's very unlikely that if the US was to ever decline significantly, that Russia would be equally friendly to African states thereafter. There's nothing to suggest it may go one way or the other. It might be Russia looking out for its own interests, whatever they may look like in 50 years' time. And I think African states are equally, at this moment in time, trying to look out for their own interests in relation to this specific event. They're doing the same in relation to Palestine, Israel, and in relation to their voting there. And when I'm suggesting that African states are trying to have some kind of independence, it's simply that they don't have any other recourse, because they don't have the military power necessarily to make a statement on the global stage. They don't have the necessary hard power. So all they have is a soft power tactics. And they have to use these tactics to their advantage, whatever that advantage may be. So there are states in Africa that are very happy to, like Kenya, for example, outrightly go against Russia and say, we do not agree with you. We think what you're doing is absolutely wrong. We're not going to say anything else, and voting in favor of all the resolutions. And then you have South Africa that wants to sit on the fence because it does have a vested interest in relationship with Russia and India and Brazil. But at the end of the day, it's not as if Russia is in need of South Africa's support in any real way. It's simply a symbolic gesture, really, and only because South Africa has some measure of influence on the continent, it's helping to nurture that relationship that it might have with South Africa. But Russia's not dependent on us. And technically, if you look at, I'm going on a little bit long here, Jonas, I'm sorry, one more minute here in my response.
Fine, Susie.
But if you look at since 1994, Russia was never on South Africa's initial agenda post-apartheid. South Africa was trying to get its own act together. It was actually seeking out friendly relations with America most of all, and also lambasting wrong action in Africa until we learned our lesson and decided we better be in solidarity with our African brothers than not, because it suited us to be in solidarity more than not. So it only became a really significant thing, despite our historical ties between the ANC and Moscow, when we became a member of BRICS. And since then, it's influenced our position in relation to Russia. And that's solely because we want the benefits of that partnership, not because Russia wants our interests, wants us as part of the partnership. So I think that it is important, is my final point of view, that African states have some type of voice, and how they showcase that voice is by abstaining in this case.
All right, thank you. Now we will take a couple of questions and then we will answer them, hopefully. Yes, please, here in the front, Jens.
Thank you. My name is Jens. I work at the Royal Danish Defence College. My question goes to what can we do against this influence meddling in Russia, in Africa from Russia. And it seems like Russia has an advantage in having these hard power tactics, so to speak, delivering the regime survival packages. And my thought is a way to counter that for European states or the EU or NATO or UN to do the same, also provide regime survival tactics, or is there another way? Because to me, that's the big question, that we kind of have very limited options here because we sort of insist on relying on the soft power ways.
Thank you. And then we have a question over here.
Hello, my name is Noel Parker. I'm retired from the Department of Political Science in Copenhagen here. Am I mistaken? Something's gone wrong on here. I felt that your remarks introducing expressed this kind of surprise that African states would abstain at the UN or would do anything independent from the West, potentially siding with the Russian side. But when we came to Susie's rather detailed account, it seemed to me that the situation of South Africa is quite similar to the situation of Denmark. That is to say, a state which relies on the international system in a big way, but is always drawn to a reflex of supporting the big brother, in this case, of course, the Danish case, the US. So it's the same tensions. Danes should understand this, as it were. So I think this is a very plausible account that Suzanne gives. And I'd like to insist on we shouldn't assume that Africa's not going to go our way. Okay, that's it.
Yes, thank you. I think we will take these two questions and then we will move on, and I will have I will go first. I will let myself go first. So in terms of Jens, what can we actually do? So I think there are three things we can do here. The first thing, that is to empower what is already a core norm of, in particularly the African Union, and that is the norm of territorial integrity and the norm of territorial integrity. And also the African Union actually has some of the most advanced norm of responsibility to protect in case of, for instance, regime change and coups and hostile takeovers, you could say. We have also seen in Africa that they have not been able to, in real terms, do so much about the coups that has taken place within the last year in Africa. But I think that would be because that's actually a strong norm, that we should respect territorial integrity. And then there's, of course, and that's maybe more to do with the sword. The European Union also has security assistance to offer. For a long time, the EU has quite successfully had training missions in Africa. The problem was that when you have trained soldiers in Africa, you could not provide them the arms they needed in order to survive or to create stability. So they called Igor and had him deliver arms, right? Because the EU was not willing to do so. Actually, the EU has come a long way. The European Peace Facility and also the EU has publicly now stated they have already provided also lethal military assistance to Africa. So there's also something to offer there that is not coming from Russia. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, have faith in African states, of course, a willingness to do good for their own countries. Yes, if you have a problem with your survival, you will have to do with whoever can help you survive, right? But there will also be a period after that where you want prosperity, you want advances and so forth. And I mean, if money talks, then Russia is not your right partner. So at a certain point, there's an evolution in this. I think we'll have to do more research in. And that is, so if you have stabilized this situation, then you can either go to the West or China. We have not talked so much about China. China is, and has been for a while, very present in Africa. But if you want to have an in-boost of economic aid or economic investments, you will have to go to the West or China. So on the longer term, that's maybe actually in the terms of economic opportunities that can be provided, that we have the real competition or the real collaboration in between China and the West. And then to the question, what we observed, that was, and I was also asked to do an interview on national Danish radio, namely what is going on in the UN. We had the impression that Africa would vote alongside with the West, primarily because of the strong norm of territorial integrity that Susie also mentioned. So it would be a no-brainer to condemn. On the other hand, yes, it was maybe a sign of Western hybris to think that Africa would always lean with the West. And I think Western politician has come a long way in facing the hypocrisy of now something is going on in Africa, why don't you support us? Sorry, in Europe, why don't you support us? Well, a lot of African ambassadors, for good reasons, said to Danish ambassadors, for good reasons, where were you when we had conflict A, B, and C? Where were your support? And I mean, I think that is a well-deserved wake-up call. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Karen?
Yeah, can I just
sure.
add very fast? I think it's a really good question. So what can we do to actually counter this influence? And I think just working with primarily the Wagner Group or this sort of PMC presence, I just really would like to stress that doing the same is not an option. Like we should definitely not go down that way. And of course it's a little bit funny to say it like this, but we do actually see sort of liberal states trying out some of the same tactics. So not the whole package, of course, but we do see influence operations also coming from the other side. When I say the other side, it's European states, of course, and I think also there are, of course, also talks now, and that's a really positive thing to sort of have. Okay, so I want to say, first of all, I think that's the wrong way to go down that road. I think much more we should sort of pull it in, and then we should see if we can't advocate why we are the better cooperation partners, and then maybe. I mean, I think there's also something, at least in what I'm looking at, there's something very present, and that's about sovereignty, and not only sovereignty in terms of this territorial sovereignty, but also sort of sovereignty in being able to manage your own state and being allowed to manage your own state, and I think just. It's a good example, right? Because as soon as some of these states, they sign agreements with the Wagner Group, some European states, they see the need to pull out or condemn this move. And I don't think I'm saying that you shouldn't do that, but it just becomes sort of it just proves to these states, for example, Mali, it just proves that they are not allowed to, they don't feel allowed to sort of manage their own partnerships. Because then the Western partners that they have a lot of opinions about who they should have as partners else. So if we sort of see it as a sovereignty question and a question of being able to manage your own state, that doesn't give any sort of very clear answers as to how do we then proceed, but I think there is something in terms of this not actually engaging in partnership with African states where European states feel that they can take part in managing that state.
Right, the final round of questions. So we have, do we have, question here in the back? Yeah, in the back, all in the back. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Prince. Part of my question was already asked. I'm from Ghana and I'm studying here in Copenhagen. And I wanted to know this issue of Russia being present in Africa. Africa is taking everything it can get because it's in a very dire situation. So every support is very welcome. However, how can they begin to differentiate which support they should take? Because the support is needed. So how can they know which support is good and which support is not, they shouldn't align themselves with? For example, this instance of Russia providing support to Africa, how would they know if there's no other alternative to the support that is being provided to them? Thank you.
We have some other questions as well. Yes, we have two in the back. Yeah. And then we take the two in. Okay, yeah, please.
Yes, okay. My name is Carl Peter Poulsen. I have one comment and one question. My comment is that when Jonas is saying that the EU should sort of pick up the fight and try to influence, then I think that we are sort of handicapped by our history. For instance, France under Macron has tried to sort of throw away the old imperialist point of view and try to engage in the Sahel area, and he has more or less been thrown out. So I think it would be very difficult for the EU to engage in at least some of the African countries. My question is about to which degree does China and Russia cooperate or fight against each other in Africa? Because many people are talking about an alliance between China and Russia in other parts of the world, which I don't believe it, but I should like to know how they are situated in Africa.
Yes, and then we had two questions in the back.
I think this is directed at you, Jonas. Remy, security advisor, Danish Red Cross. I'm just curious about the timing of Denmark's future engagement with Africa that was launched this new year at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sort of an engagement or a process of new engagement with Africa. Is the timing of that significant? Is there any relationship between the timing of this initiative and a surge in concern about Russian influence in Africa, and why is Denmark choosing to sort of vocally care more about Africa now? Thank you.
Yes, and then we had a question. That's the final question, right? Yeah.
Okay, my name is Emil and I live in Denmark for 35 years. I'm retired now. My question is, listening to the Western media until now, I had the impression that Russia is dying. But now listening to you, in Africa, Russia is rising. Are Russia is dying or exhausted, or Russia is rising?
Yeah. So do some of my fellow panelists want to chip in? They should feel free to. Yeah, Susie?
Thanks, Jonas. Let me quickly take a stab at one or two of these. I think that for the first question there from my colleague from Ghana, I think it's basically how African states play the political game. The question was, how do you decipher which support is good support and which support is bad support? But in Africa, I think any support is good support if it's going to mean that you're able to essentially arrive at your national interest in some way, and if it's going to benefit your citizens, and if it's going to benefit your future and your own development. But the other thing that you have to balance that against is, what is your government's philosophy? How does it want to be seen on the world stage? Is your government a democratic government? I mean, there is something to be said for trying to project an image globally. And there is something to be said for trying to be seen to be a good international citizen. And that's part of development as well. And that's part of evolution as well. And I've written also about South Africa trying to be a good international citizen. So that's why I'm using this phrase, because it's such a tricky game to play. But ultimately, you have to play the political game. My opinion is you take the support, whatever that support is if it benefits your national survival or your national interest. But obviously, people are going to question what your national interest is and what is that based on? What kind of constitution do you have? How do you want to project your image internationally? In terms of measures of influence, for example, between China and Russia in Africa, I think they both have influence in Africa. I think they're vying for attention, African states' attention. I think it's just a different approach and a different focus in some ways in relation to how they approach states in the first place, what types of arrangements they create with states. China is very hands-on in its economic engagements with states, especially Zimbabwe, etc., and in terms of what it can help do to create infrastructural growth. Even though it benefits China's trade, obviously it benefits the African countries too. And African citizens see a real difference in relation to that. And so they may have more faith in China because they seem to walk the talk. They bring development. Whereas Russia, it's more of a political game and more of a soft power approach and diplomatic approach. So I think it's really just about how the two different countries focus their attention and their approach on the continent.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonas.
Thank you so much, Susie. Karen, do you have something you want to fill in on?
Yeah, I also think just in terms of this Russia and China sort of cooperation or competition, I think just from my focus, I also don't see a competition, at least in this in this sphere of private military companies and the way that they're used. They're used very differently. Russia used them quite differently than China used them, and I haven't seen or detected any sort of overlap or competition emerge in this sphere. And I think also in terms of Russia rising or leaving Africa, I would definitely say that Russia is continuing to engage on the African continent, and they are also doing new missions. But I would also say that they are also very aware of how to make their presence seen. They are also what we see now, and also in terms of the private military companies, it's moving into a very sort of showy presence. It used to be much more of a shadowy presence, if we can say it like that. That it was sort of hidden away from TV cameras and photographers, and that's not the case anymore. So the arrival both in Burkina Faso and Niger was televised. So it's much more of a presence that they want to be seen engaging.
Yeah, thank you. I will conclude with a couple of more questions. We will be taking some questions afterwards, but we are running out of time. So in terms of timing of the Africa re-engagement from Denmark's perspective, I mean, it has been a long time coming, right? It has been underway for quite some time. But I think that the Ukraine crisis also, in terms of African strategies, has amplified the strategic awareness on what could be potentially be at stake. So, I mean, the war has amplified awareness strategically on so many issues, also Africa. I mean, this project is part of the Danish ambition to increase knowledge because of its bid for the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member. But definitely, I mean, Denmark is one country among many others that is looking towards Africa, the perspectives, but also the challenges arising there. So maybe there could be some timing, but I more see it as an amplification, to be honest. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't work there. And then finally, is Russia exhausted or is it rising? I think that's a question that boggles me almost every night. Personally, I see Russia's assertiveness here as assertiveness on the cheap. I mean, Russia is, as I used to play, really good at playing a poor hand wisely, right? I mean, they can do a lot to disrupt, but that is only a second best strategy. I mean, what is really the goal Russia is trying to achieve with its policies in Europe or in Africa? I mean, we also talked about it from the perspective of other countries. I mean, is it to have less of the US and the West, but then the rise of what? I mean, rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria said, yes, definitely. But the rise of what norms, what playbook? I mean, and there I think there is more disagreement also within Russia on what should replace it. So Russia is more resilient than we usually think. I mean, they can durate a lot. But I also think in terms of actually effect, and this is important also in regard to the first question, they are often less significant than we think. So we should definitely be very, very careful not to overstate the effect of Russian initiatives. On the other hand, of course, we should not downplay the role of being a disruptor, even though it's your second best strategy, right? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think we should give them another round of applause for sharing your knowledge. And thank you for beautiful questions. Unfortunately, we cannot be here the entire afternoon. Have a lovely day. And I think I will at least be available for questions for some minutes. Yes.